Diolch yn fawr iawn. Pleser mawr cael bod gyda chi heno. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. Mark mentioned, I wasn't going to begin with this, but I've just changed my mind and I think I will mention it. You mentioned belonging, how important belonging is, and how important it is for people in Wales, and how prone that makes us to homesickness and hiraeth, which is such a big thing in Wales. And it reminds me of how we almost luxuriate in the idea of hiraeth and homesickness. And this struck me particularly when my brother got married a few years ago and we had a wedding singer. His name was Davy Chris. Davy Chris had a wonderful performance costume, which was a blouson jacket made entirely out of red dragons. Quite something. He had 2 amplifiers the size of large refrigerators, and he had a very good, strong tenor voice. Repertoire, Delilah, Nessun Dorma, and some songs he'd written himself, which were actually quite good. And they were about the pain of exile. Now, I grew up with Davy Chris. We went to the same village infant school and primary school. And these songs about the pain of exile, the agony of not being able to come home to Wales. And they were actually very moving. Anyway, afterwards, I had a chat with Davy Chris, and I said, Davy Chris, I said, those songs of exile? He said, oh yes. I said, yes. It's tough, isn't it? I said, yeah. I said, but Davy Chris, I said, you've never left the village. You live in the house you were born in. And he said, oh yes, I know that, he said, quite very sincerely. He said, but I imagine what it would be like to leave. So hiraeth, we're big on hiraeth. But that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. We're here to talk about the coronation. Now, last year I gave a brief talk on the coronation music to some visiting overseas philanthropists in London. And at the end, one of them queried why people would want to go to such an expense to celebrate one person. Now, I hadn't expected the question, and I answered instinctively, but I hope correctly. They're not celebrating one person. They're celebrating themselves, their society, their values, their history, all the things on which they pride themselves, centred on a person, perhaps, expressed in and by and through a person. But ultimately, all that solemnity, all that splendour is about us, what we want to say and believe about ourselves. Now, if there are any constitutional scholars here, you'll recognise that such an improvised and expedient answer is not going to replace any of Walter Bagehot's celebrated definitions of the role of monarchy. But it does, I hope, speak to at least one aspect of the coronation, which is the degree to which it represents our current society, its relationship to our past, and its hopes for the future. This was one of the guiding principles as His Majesty puts together the music for his coronation in May last year. The King is one of history's great royal patrons of the arts, with wide and deep specialist knowledge of painting, architecture, literature, and of course, music. He's the supportive and hugely well-informed patron of hundreds of arts organisations, including several orchestras, the Philharmonia, the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, Welsh National Opera, the Royal Opera, notice the order in which I put those, the Royal College of Music, and the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama. Now, with such a background, programming the music for this coronation was never going to be done by an official committee. It was always going to be deeply personal. I worked for the King from 2012 onwards as his assistant and then later Deputy Private Secretary for the whole of the UK, dealing with Wales, yes, but also Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the whole of the UK. And in that capacity, I was responsible for a wide range of his interests across the UK, including health, education, heritage, and the arts. And it was in that latter capacity that the coronation work came my way. In October 2022, when I was accompanying His Majesty on a visit to Scotland, he asked me in that disarmingly apologetic way that he has, whether I would mind awfully helping with the coronation music. The answer to that is, of course, yes. Now, I'd assumed he meant perhaps suggesting one or two pieces. In fact, it meant putting his wishes into practice for the whole musical programme. 4 hours of music, 44 separate pieces, choral, solo, plain song, orchestral, organ, a cappella, and 12 new compositions, more than for any previous coronation. And in doing this, it would be necessary to balance the traditional and the contemporary, to ensure the nations of the UK were represented, to reflect the diversity of our society, our Commonwealth, to include famous names, but also to give opportunity for younger artists as well. And there would be 400 million people watching. And we had to do it all in barely 6 months. Now you'll know, of course, that Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth ascended the throne in February 1952, but was not crowned until the June of the following year. That's a full 17 months later. We had a third of that time. Now, although the timetable was greatly accelerated, His Majesty's lifelong personal love of music was a huge asset. Where time was so much of the essence, rather than convene a committee, we formed a small working group of 3. Myself and 2 good friends of mine, 2 endlessly resourceful experts who had worked with His Majesty as patron of their orchestras for years. These were David Welson, who'd been managing director of the Philharmonia Orchestra for 29 years, and James Williams, managing director of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra and former deputy at the Philharmonia. They knew His Majesty's tastes, and crucially, they had encyclopedic knowledge of the classical music world, its procedures and its personalities. They also had seemingly inexhaustible resources of patience, which I can assure you were needed. Now, the ceremony was to take just over 2 hours, and the audience would be seated for 2 hours before that. So, counting a quarter of an hour of recessional music as well, we needed some 4 hours of music in total. Now, as my own work pattern was 4 days in the palace and a weekend here in Wales, a great deal of the organising work was actually done from here in Brecon and Priory Hill House, where Sally and I live. And this included many telephone conversations with the King as the arrangements progressed. Now, in putting together the musical programme, there were many different considerations. We needed, of course, to include all the, well, perhaps not all, but many of the major items from previous coronations, the great pieces, the indispensable, spine-chilling I Was Glad by Parry, Zadok the Priest by Handel, Crown Imperial by Walton, Nimrod by Elgar, Jupiter from the Planets by Holst, and the arrival of the Queen of Sheba by Handel. So that took up quite a bit of the programme, as you can imagine. But also, we need contemporary composers as well. Because of course, after all, every one of those previous commissions, those great pieces, they were all new commissions in their day. And we have to create room for new music. We also, of course, needed to incorporate the elements of the Mass, the Kyrie, the Agnus Dei, the Sanctus, and so on. And it all had to be as representative as possible in terms of the style of music and the background of the performers. So how to balance tradition and modernity, how to represent the Commonwealth and its many cultures. Well, we had a go. We put together a draft programme and sent it to the King with sound files for reference using a well-known digital music service, which I shan't mention by name in case they expect a royal warrant. We sent that to the King, and it came back with about 25% of the programme agreed. But with a host of other suggestions and requests for pieces to be explored, leads to be followed, and people to be approached. All of it evidence of the King's comprehensive knowledge and intense passion when it comes to the question of musical choices. One example, the king remembered visiting Lincoln Cathedral a good 20 years earlier for a opening of a new rose window there. And he remembered a specially commissioned piece which had been performed there. He wanted to commission that composer. That was Tariq O'Regan, and that's how Tariq O'Regan came to be the composer of the Coronation Agnus Dei. Even further back, the king remembered the young Sir Kenneth Branagh coming to see him for insights into how to play Prince Hal. And he remembered the music of Sir Ken's actually very good 1989 film Henry V, and the film music for that, so that's how Patrick Doyle came to be commissioned to write the Coronation March. Now, the Welsh composer Paul Miller had been confirmed very early on. The king agreed without hesitation. In fact, it was in that first conversation on the way to Scotland with my suggestion that one of the pieces should be in Welsh. Now, think about that for a moment. All the coronations of the past, how thrilled we would have been had the Welsh language been included in any of those, in 37, in 1910, in 53. But it was 2023 when the Welsh language actually was included for the first time in what is the greatest ceremony of our state. Now, the decision was taken that the item that would be performed in Welsh was the Kyrie, and it was chosen because it occurs early in the service, and it symbolised the king moving from his former role as the longest-serving Prince of Wales to his new role as king. And instead of the Greek text, we used the words from the Welsh prayer book. Arglwydd trigger ha, Christ trigger ha, arglwydd trigger ha. And of course, we could only imagine one voice to perform that piece, that of Sir Bryn Terfel. Thankfully, he was available on the day, in between engagements in Germany. So on Coronation Day, with Sir Bryn's thrilling performance, the Welsh language had a place of honour at the heart of our society's most significant ceremony before an audience of hundreds of millions around the world. Now, we're going to hear another piece from the coronation, from the pre-service. This is a piece called Sacred Fire, and it doesn't have a Welsh composer. It was composed by Sarah Class. It does, however, have a Welsh lyricist. This was a piece I had written the words for a little earlier, and which Sarah sets to music for the coronation. And now, with Erin Thomas's performance, we're going to hear that song performed.
And lead us through the desert by your light.
absolutely not. Thank you. Now, this is probably the place to talk a little more about the King and the Welsh language. As is known, His Majesty studied Welsh for a few months in Aberystwyth in 1969 as he prepared for his investiture, making a confident speech to the Urdd shortly afterwards and speaking clearly as the ceremony itself in Caernarfon. Over the years, he continued to use Welsh expressions regularly in speeches, letters and conversation. His knowledge of the Welsh language and culture is surprisingly wide, and his love for them is heartfelt and unquestioning. I'll illustrate that with two examples. Some years ago, we were on the way to an engagement in Carmarthen, and he was reviewing his speech, which had, of course, various Welsh phrases in it. And as he was going through this in the back of the car, he turned to me and said, "Is that how you spell Cynheuadd?" Now, Cynheuadd, as those of you who are Welsh speakers will know, is Welsh for harvest. And no, that indeed was not how it was spelled, because there was a typographical error in it. Now, you're talking, therefore, about the level of understanding whereby you can spot a typographical error in a not that familiar word. On another occasion, we were, I think, heading into Buckingham Palace, and had been earlier that day at an agricultural show in England, and were discussing some of the things that have been seen that day, including an enormous pig, whose size itself was a point to remark on. And the King said, yes, it was like Twrch Trwyth. Yes, that's right. So those of you familiar with the Mabinogion recognise Twrch Trwyth. But how many people in Wales would compare a pig to Twrch Trwyth? Not many is the answer. The King does. And that's the level of understanding he has, which is really, really deep and, as I say, very heartfelt. Now, in addition to the Kyrie, the Welsh language was used a second time in the service as well. Traditionally, as the King was being prepared for his anointing, the most sacred part of the service, the Veni Creator Spiritus is sung in plain song in a 1625 English translation of the Latin original. This time, it was decided to take the opportunity to further show the King's support for the Celtic languages of Britain. So the first and last verses remained in English, but the other three were respectively Welsh, Scottish Gaelic in Ian Urquharton's translation, and Irish, translated by Damien McManus. Again, worth pausing. Welsh, Gaelic and Irish in the coronation of the sovereign of the United Kingdom. The Westminster Abbey Choir under Andrew Netzinger rose to the occasion faultlessly, even including the tricky S sound, which if you listen to the recordings, they nail it. It was very satisfying to see how appreciative the audience was to see Britain's indigenous languages given their proper place. Now, here I want to mention another element, a Welsh element of the coronation, which is not musical this time. This is the Cross of Wales. Now, this magnificent artifact, I'll show you a picture of it to illustrate. There's this. It's the Cross of Wales. At the Goldsmiths Review, the Goldsmiths Company were instrumental in making this piece, and the Cross of Wales was one of the stars of the show. Now, this artifact was created by the silversmith Michael Lloyd in a project overseen and generously paid for by the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths. This had its origin in 2019, when Sally and I were coming back from London, where I'd been working. We were discussing pretty much what we've been discussing now, the King's, well, Prince of Wales as he then was, his love for and knowledge of Welsh culture and Welsh history. And it occurred to us that His Majesty might wish to mark the centenary of the foundation of the church in Wales in 2020 by commissioning a cross. referencing the Groes Naid. The Groes Naid was the lost relic of the House of Gwynedd, which was acquired as the conquest of Wales in 1282 by Edward I, and later lost. This was the same campaign during which Edward, a decade later, acquired the Stone of Destiny, which is not lost, but the relics of the House of Gwynedd were. Now, His Majesty readily agreed to the suggestion, and the project began in late 2019. It was then, of course, like so many things, paused by the pandemic, and then resumed afterwards with the vital help of the goldsmiths. Now, while I was working at Clarence House, which is part of St James's Palace, I was in the habit of attending morning prayer in the Chapel Royal, which is a very historic location that dates back to the time of Henry VIII. Now, when the sub-dean of the Chapel Royal, Canon Paul Wright, who was Welsh on his mother's side, heard about the cross, he immediately arranged that this new sacred artefact would lead the coronation procession itself into Westminster Abbey. So to think that the cross only a few years earlier was simply an idea, that was wonderful enough. But there was more to come, because a later chance conversation during a visit by His Majesty to the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster's house in London led to Pope Francis offering a piece of the true cross to be incorporated into the design. The original Groes Naid had been a reliquary with a piece of the true cross in it. So Pope Francis very kindly gave one of the Vatican's pieces of the true cross, and as we heard subsequently from one of his staff, one of our better ones. And with only perhaps 10 days to go before the coronation, Canon Paul and I received this piece of the true cross from the Pope's representative at the high altar of the Chapel Royal, and then I took it to the Goldsmith Centre in London, where the silversmith Michael Lloyd was waiting anxiously to incorporate it into the final design, maybe only 10 days before the coronation. The cross itself had been hallmarked personally by the King in November that year, and the first time the King's mark had been applied there, perhaps you can see him applying the marks, he was in person, the first time the King's mark had been applied to an artefact actually by the King. So that was really a special moment. So on Coronation Day, the royal party were led into the abbey behind a cross bearing the words in Welsh from the last prayer of Dewi Sant, Byddwch lawen, cadwch y ffydd, gwnewch y pethau bychain, be joyful, keep the faith, do the little things. And many commentators mentioned what an extraordinarily significant ecumenical gesture this was, that a relic gifted by the Pope should play such a prominent role in the coronation of the supreme governor of the Church of England. Now that's certainly true, but I must admit that whatever its ecumenical significance may have been, it was because of my love for my home country that I watched the cross with particular pleasure and pride as it passed by me along the Abbey nave towards the chancel on that unforgettable day. After the coronation, the cross was displayed at the Goldsmiths Hall until January this year, when it came back permanently to Wales, and it will be shared between the Church in Wales and the Catholic Church in Wales. It's already been used at several events, including the National Prayer Breakfast in the Senedd only a month ago. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that this ceremony was not just about the sovereign, but about our society. And if Welsh people could take pride from seeing the cross, from hearing our language, or for that matter, hearing the royal harpist Alice Hughes perform Sir Carl Jenkins's gorgeous setting of the Welsh folk tune Trossegare, which was also part of the coronation music, or hearing the coronation orchestra play Rafe Vaughan Williams's lovely setting of the hymn tune Rosa Medra, then people from other sections of society will equally be alert for signals that they too have been recognised and included. Now, if this talk has a message, it is perhaps the need for symbolism to be inclusive. And I'll say a little about how this was addressed. Well, we heard a little earlier Sacred Fire. Now that was performed on the day by Pretty Yende, a South African soprano, who, if you watched that part of the service, you'll recall wore that magnificent yellow dress. Hugely significant for a black performer to take part in the coronation service. It's the first time that's ever happened. Hugely significant for her home country. Let's look at the home nations. Scotland. Well, Dame Judith Weir, the master of the King's music, was commissioned to write the piece Brighter Visions Shine Afar in the pre-service music. She's of Scottish background. Patrick Doyle is a Scot as well, did the Coronation March. Scotland were also to have their own coronation, the Honours of Scotland ceremony in Edinburgh in July, and I'll come on to that a little later. For Northern Ireland, I mentioned the use of the Irish language. Now, the Irish language is primarily associated, of course, with the nationalist community in Northern Ireland, and that's good that they were included. From the Protestant tradition, we included choristers from the Methodist Girls' College of Belfast in the choir. And we also commissioned what turned out to be a ravishing setting with the beautiful Irish hymn tune, Be Thou My Vision. And this was set as a triptych by Nigel Hess, Shirley Thompson and Roderick Williams. So Roderick Williams is actually himself half Welsh on his father's side. And he was also one of the 3 soloists in the coronation. So those are the Celtic countries, but we mustn't forget Cornwall, of course. The king, of course, had been Duke of Cornwall for most of his life. And Cornwall was represented by the presence in the choir of choristers from Truro Cathedral. Then, again, thinking of representation, the Coronation Orchestra. At His Majesty's special request, they were composed of members of his main musical patronages. But there was only room for 40 musicians due to severe restrictions of space. In fact, I mentioned Trosagareg a little earlier, that wonderful Welsh hymn tune. That was set to music by Sir Carl Jenkins, originally for 2 harps. So if you buy a recording of that, it's done for 2 harps. And the people running the orchestra came to me and said, well, we haven't got room for 2 harps. Now, I fancy myself as a bit of a fixer, and I thought, there'll be room for 2 harps. You just need a tape measure and a bit of ingenuity, and there'll be room for 2 harps. Now, there really wasn't. There was not room for 2 harps. So that piece had to be completely reorchestrated for a single harp. And if you listen to the coronation recording, which is lovely, it's a single harp. That's how tight we were on space. So many of the pieces actually had to be reorchestrated. The Wiener Philharmonica fanfare, which is a great favourite of the King's, had to be completely reorchestrated because we had actually far fewer brass instruments than it normally requires. Paul Mealer did that as well. So the 40 musicians represented all His Majesty's orchestral patronages, the Royal Opera House, the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, the Philharmonia Orchestra, Welsh National Opera, English Chamber Orchestra, Scottish Chamber Orchestra, BBC National Orchestra of Wales. And we literally had to measure out the organ loft to the inch. Paul Mealer did many of the reorchestrations, and John Rutter, of course, the wonderful sacred composer, did many of the others. Now, the orchestra were under the baton of the brilliant Sir Antonio Papano of the Royal Opera House, and he performed marvels in what must be the most challenging concert of a lifetime. He was up in the organ loft with the orchestra in front of him. At one point he had a soprano in part of the clear story, the choir below in the chancel, and fanfare trumpeters somewhere else. And in a place that size, those of you who are involved in music will realise the delay that there can be in the cue and in the travelling of the sound. He did it all seamlessly. It was awe-inspiring. Now, I mentioned composers Judith Weir, Shirley Thompson, Sarah Class, who composed Sacred Fire. No music by a woman had ever been performed as a coronation until this one. This time, 5 of the 12 new commissions were by female composers. Roxana Panufnik composed the haunting Sanctus, Debbie Wiseman, the upbeat gospel alleluias, which were delivered appropriately enough in gospel style by the Ascension Choir, who were specially recruited for the occasion by Abimbola Amioko Jimpe, at His Majesty's particular request. So that's the question of female composers. And for the Commonwealth, well, I mentioned South Africa with Pretty Yende, and Roderick Williams and Shirley Thompson are both of Jamaican heritage. But with 56 nations, we were not going to be able to represent all of that in the coronation music. We did have a good try, because we included 12 well-known tunes from Commonwealth nations in Ian Farrington's very jazzy Voices of the World organ composition. So we managed to represent probably a quarter of the Commonwealth countries in that way. For the rest, then the ceremonial elements of the coronation, with the prominence accorded to official representatives, people of Commonwealth background, and as you may have seen with the presentation of some of the sacred objects, those served to honour this essential part of the sovereign's responsibilities as head of the Commonwealth. So we mentioned gender, nationality, ethnicity, but there's more to inclusion than those characteristics. There's also the question of style. The service would certainly be characterised by the incomparable sacred music with which the Anglican Church excels so brilliantly. And some of the new commissions, such as the Sanctus and the Agnus Dei, were distinguished additions to that canon. But would it be possible to retain the atmosphere of reverence and also include elements that might speak to people of different musical tastes? So this is certainly what was attempted. The most prominent example, of course, would be Lord Lloyd Webber's coronation anthem, Make a Joyful Noise, based on Psalm 100, and informed, naturally enough, by his background in musical theatre. Several of the composers, Sarah Class, Nigel Hess, Patrick Doyle, Debbie Wiseman, they're all well known for their work in film and television, and if you listen to the pieces, you can hear that filmic, cinematic quality to them, and their communicative, engaging style. Now, the appreciative commentary in the media, both popular and specialist, which commended the breadth and inclusivity, gave us hope that the programme had indeed come close to achieving that aim. So, after the coronation, there was a very brief moment to relax, but then we had to turn our attention to the Honours of Scotland ceremony, which is in effect the Scottish coronation. As you may know, there are two sets of crown jewels in these islands. There's the ones we're all familiar with from the coronation in the Abbey, but of course there's the Scottish ones, famously rediscovered by Sir Walter Scott in the 19th century after they'd been hidden away for years. Now, the ceremony of the Honours of Scotland takes place in St Giles Cathedral, and the regalia are presented, touched but not actually put on. But it's still a ceremony of huge significance. This took place on the 5th of July. It was probably in early June that we realised we needed to get on with it in putting together the music for the Scottish ceremony. It's not a 4-hour event, it's a 2-hour event. But we had our first meeting with the King in June, and we put together the music for the Scottish coronation in 29 days, and that includes all the commissions, rehearsal time, and everything. And again, prominent in the work there was Paul Mealer. Oh, I just called him Sir Paul Mealer. I don't know if that's prophetic. He was given the LDO. I know Paul very well, and she'll pull his leg about that. He was given the LDO. He was made a lieutenant of the Victorian Order after his work there, but maybe he's going to get an upgrade in due course, who knows. So Paul Mealer, who is a Welshman, but is the Professor of Composition in Aberdeen University, he was one of the people who helped put together that musical programme. We're going to hear one of those pieces now. It was specially composed for the occasion. It's called A Song of Thanksgiving and Dedication. It was composed by one of Paul Mealer's pupils, Joanna Gill, and it's going to be performed now by Louise Wood.
thought when it was springtime, nae sun could be so bright. We thought when it was summer, nae day could be so licht. We thought when it was east, there was the big good, and winter brought me promise when the heart could wood, and the winters brought me promise love when the heart could wood, and the winters brought me promise when the heart could wood, and the winters brought me promise love when the heart could wood, and the winters brought me promise when the heart could wood. And the winters brought me promise love when the heart could wood, and the winters brought me promise when the heart could wood, and the winters brought me promise love when the heart could wood, and the winters brought me promise when the heart could wood.
Well, thank you, Louise. That was gorgeous. That really was lovely. Now, we come to what really is a coda to the rest of the talk, and that is moving on from the music to the King and Queen's visits to Brecon for their coronation visits to Wales. Now, of course, post-coronation, their Majesties wanted to visit all the corners of the United Kingdom, and there was a choice, really, a question as to where in Wales it should get the first visit after the coronation. Now, the King and Queen, of course, had visited Cardiff in September 2022, shortly after the funeral of the late Queen. And in December of that year, they visited Wrexham to present city status. This was a very significant visit for me personally, because Wrexham is my hometown. And then the new Prince and Princess of Wales had visited Swansea in September as well, and also a number of other locations in the south in early 2023. So we had to choose somewhere that had not had a recent visit. So probably mid-Wales, and where better than Brecon. So that's Brecon's moment came there at that time. Now, Brecon, many of you will know this better than I do. I've only lived in Brecon since the beginning of 2021. But there are many royal connections. The King is a patron of the agricultural show, and perhaps those of you with sharp eyes will notice that I'm wearing the tie here, so I'm on message with the agricultural show tie. And he's also patron of the Institute of Christ's College, and also of several of the military units associated with the army headquarters. And so, with the help of the Welsh Government, with the Town Council, a number of local individuals, we scheduled the visit to start at the cathedral, where a reception was held for local organisations, as well as a short performance of the jazz mass. And we then went down to the town centre for a taster of the agricultural show, which of course was not due until August. And the organisers did incredible work in putting on a varied exhibition on a very, very tight schedule. It was really very, very impressive indeed. Then at Theatre Brecon, the King and Queen met with the then First Minister, Mark Drakeford, with another reception for members of the local organisations. I know some of the people who were presented on that occasion are here tonight. The Queen then went on to meet members of the Women's Aid organisation, and while the King went on to the army headquarters on the Watton to meet members of his various military units, including, of course, the Gurkhas. And that was where I said goodbye to him as he drove away in the official Bentley, which was had on its bonnet, for the first time ever, a silver red dragon sculpture made by the jewellery company Garage as a coronation gift. Now, so that had its debut here in Brecon. So to conclude, I began by mentioning that the coronation ceremony is not just about one person, it's about a whole society expressing itself, reflecting to itself, projecting itself to the world. It draws on our tradition, it celebrates our present, and it seeks to anticipate what we hope for the future. Now, how well it was done, that's for future historians to judge. How many of the new commission's future audiences will want to hear? Well, those future audiences will infallibly decide. But I very much hope, as all who love and admire the King will hope, that the coronation of 2023, the music included, will be seen, yes, as an expression of a society's ideals at a particular time, but also, and perhaps above all, will be seen as evidence of King Charles III's lifelong, selfless dedication to and love for all the people of all the lands of which he is called to be king. So diolch o galon a Duw gadwar.
So we're now going to have an opportunity for Q&A. Phil back here is armed with a microphone. So if you raise your hand when you want to ask a question, especially if it's a really difficult one, Phil will find you with his microphone and you can ask away.
I might not answer the difficult ones. Anyone got an easy one to start with? Nothing too challenging now, Jonathan.
I've met the King about 5 times, and I think they wanted me to be his emperor at one stage, but I was far too shy to do that sort of thing. And I wonder really whether the present Prince of Wales has the love for Wales that King Charles had, and is he going to be imbued with the culture of Wales? I know I've sent him a couple of my books, but have very nice thank you letters. But even so, do you think the Prince of Wales, the present Prince of Wales and the Princess of Wales would grow to like Wales? I notice he's not taking over the house in Llandovery, so I hope he's going to have a house somewhere in Wales.
Well, Jonathan, Well, you've started very well by sending in your books, Jonathan, so there'll be no excuse for not being well informed. Well, it's every Prince of Wales, every member of the royal family does things in their own way. It is one of the characteristics of the monarchy that, as well as being symbolic, it is also personal, and that's why it matters so much that the king took such a personal interest in the music, and of course he has been the Prince of Wales for longer than any other holder of the title. On that question, of course, I might mention there's a common misconception that he became Prince of Wales in 1969. He didn't. He became Prince of Wales in 1958, when he was 10 years old, when his mother gave him the title. Prior to that, he was playing Prince Charles, and he became Prince of Wales in 1958, when the then Empire Games were taking place in Cardiff, and his mother conferred the title on him. He was then formally invested with it in 1969, which is the ceremony everybody remembers. And of course, therefore, was Prince of Wales for 60 plus years before he became king. So he had plenty of time during that time to develop the love of Wales, which I've talked about here, given some illustrations of. The new Prince of Wales will do things in his own way. We might look at his great love for Welsh rugby, and where he is a passionate, hugely informed Welsh rugby fan, and has been for very many years. And that is certainly one way of involving oneself, being committed to and expressing one's love for this wonderful country.
Thank you, Grahame. I'm a huge fan of your poetry, and I love the way you introduce into it natural forms, and that you use the word the rosebud and the briar in the piece for the Coronation and in all your pieces. And I wanted to ask you why you chose the rosebud and the briar, but also from reading it, it comes from a deep sense of belief, and I wanted to ask you a little bit if you could unpack that, please, as well.
Certainly. At the heart of Sacred Fire, I suppose there's two elements to it. It has many references to fire, which are in the Bible. There's you sever us from Eden with the sword. That's the angels with the flaming sword that prevents Adam and Eve from returning to Eden. Lead us through the desert by your light, the pillar of fire that guided the Israelites out of. You make your prophet's word a burning coal. Of course, you're the touching of the lips with the burning coal in the prophets, and tend the lonely temple lamp at night. That's Eli and Samuel. So it goes on. You let the firelight reveal our shame. That's Peter, the betrayal of Peter the night before the crucifixion. Your love can make the heart within us burn. That's the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Did our hearts not burn within us, as he opened to us the scriptures, and so on. So there are all of those references. So in that case, fire can convict, it can inspire, it can lead, it can do so many different things. They are contrasting, but also complementary. God doesn't do just one thing. He does multiple things in multiple ways, and fire is not just one element or one experience. So I think there are 8 examples there of the way in which fire produces different effects in the life of the people of God or of the individual believer. So that's one element to it. The other element is paradox, and this is coming to your question of the rosebud and the briar. Wisdom is the sunset, is the sunlight and the snow. your beauty is the rosebud and the briar. Well, the rosebud is lovely, the briar is actually quite, well, obviously it's the crown of thorns as well. So God's care and love, concern, involvement with mankind is expressed sometimes in beauty and sometimes in much more challenging circumstances. So that piece is packed with the paradoxes which are part of the human life and which religious people interpret as part of their spiritual life. Anyone else?
Did 6 months, really, did the king ever doubt that it was going to happen, and were there compromises?
That's a very good question. Yes, the king and doubts. He's not big on doubts, I would have to say, when it comes to putting things into practice. He has high ideals and high standards and high expectations, and those who've been privileged to work for or with him are used to rising to the occasion. So, no, I didn't come across any doubts. I had plenty of doubts. I had enough doubt for all of us. So I was the designated doubter there, I think. And and with the other elements, the question was compromises. Were there compromises? I think there was compromise on the number of instruments, as we mentioned earlier, and we covered that compromise with reorchestrations, which were done by John Rutt and Paul Mealer. Yes, I suppose there were things we would have liked to include, but couldn't. We had to keep it to 4 hours. There were many things we would have liked to include, but couldn't. I didn't talk about the Byzantine chants ensemble, the Greek Orthodox choir. We had organised the music down to literally the last second. And it was a question with something like Sacred Fire. It's 3 minutes 30. Well, can you make it 3 minutes 28? It was that kind of level. Having done all of that, and remember there's lots of other moving parts, trimming perhaps a verse of a hymn here and there, we did that. When all of those things were done, and we thought, right,